I babysat my niece for the weekend, and my sister-in-law is suing me for child endangerment. The process server handed me the papers on a Friday afternoon while I was loading groceries into my car outside Whole Foods. Her name was stamped on official court documents, Melanie Reeves versus Catherine Green, with my 5-year-old niece Sophie listed as the minor child at the center of a lawsuit demanding $2.3 million in damages for negligence, child endangerment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I read the complaint 3 times standing in the parking lot, my frozen vegetables thawing in the summer heat, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. According to the lawsuit, I'd allowed Sophie to sustain serious injuries during a weekend visit 2 months ago, failed to seek appropriate medical attention, endangered her physical and emotional well-being, and caused lasting trauma requiring extensive therapy and medical intervention. The allegations were detailed and horrifying. They were also completely fabricated. I'd babysat Sophie for a single weekend in May while my brother Nathan and his wife Melanie attended a medical conference in Chicago. Sophie had been perfectly fine when they picked her up Sunday evening. We'd spent the weekend baking cookies, watching animated movies, and playing in my backyard. She'd left my house happy and healthy. Now Melanie was claiming I'd nearly killed her daughter, and the documentation attached to the lawsuit suggested she had evidence to prove it. I'd been working as a pediatric nurse for 8 years, specializing in emergency care at Children's Hospital downtown. My entire career involved protecting kids, treating their injuries, advocating for their safety. The idea that I'd endanger my own niece was absurd. Nathan and I had always been close, talking multiple times weekly, celebrating holidays together. When he'd married Melanie 3 years ago, I'd welcomed her into our family enthusiastically. She was a pharmaceutical sales rep, polished and ambitious, with a warmth that seemed genuine during family gatherings. Sophie had been born 2 years into their marriage, a beautiful little girl with Nathan's dark curls and Melanie's green eyes. I'd been present at the hospital when Sophie was born, one of the first people to hold her. I'd babysit regularly since then, building a relationship with my niece that felt special and important. When Nathan called in early May asking if I could watch Sophie for the weekend while he and Melanie attended a conference, I'd agreed immediately without hesitation. It was a pharmaceutical industry event where Melanie was receiving an award for sales performance. Nathan, who worked as a hospital administrator, was accompanying her. They'd be gone Friday evening through Sunday afternoon, less than 48 hours. Sophie was excited about the sleepover, packing her favorite stuffed animals and princess pajamas. That Friday evening when they dropped Sophie off, everything seemed normal. Melanie gave me detailed instructions about bedtime routines, dietary preferences, emergency contacts. She seemed a bit tense, but I attributed that to work stress and travel anxiety. Nathan hugged Sophie goodbye and thanked me for watching her. They left around 6 p.m., and Sophie and I ordered pizza for dinner. We played board games, watched Frozen for probably the 100th time in her young life, and she went to bed around 8:30 without any issues. Saturday morning, we made pancakes shaped like animals using cookie cutters. We spent the afternoon in my backyard, where Sophie played on the swing set while I weeded my garden beds. She scraped her knee slightly when she tripped running toward the house for a snack. A minor abrasion I cleaned with soap and water before applying a bandage. She cried for maybe 30 seconds before being distracted by the prospect of ice cream. That evening, we baked chocolate chip cookies and decorated them with frosting. Sophie got frosting in her hair, and we laughed while I helped her wash it out during bath time. Sunday morning, we went to the farmer's market downtown, where Sophie picked out fresh strawberries and convinced me to buy her a flower crown. We returned home for lunch, and she played with dolls in my living room while I prepared grilled cheese sandwiches. When Nathan and Melanie arrived Sunday at 3 p.m., Sophie ran to hug them, chattering excitedly about our weekend adventures. Melanie seemed distracted, checking her phone repeatedly while Nathan loaded Sophie's belongings into their car. I mentioned the minor knee scrape from Saturday, showing Melanie the small bandage. She barely glanced at it, saying kids get scrapes all the time. They thanked me and left. I felt good about the weekend, thinking we'd had fun and everything had gone smoothly. Over the following weeks, I noticed Nathan becoming less responsive to my texts and calls. When I suggested lunch the following weekend, he said they were busy. When I asked about getting together for Mother's Day since our mom was visiting from Florida, he said they had other plans. I felt hurt by the distance but assumed they were dealing with work stress or marital issues. I never imagined Melanie was building a case against me. The lawsuit documents told a different story than the reality I'd experienced. According to Melanie's complaint, Sophie had returned from my care with multiple bruises on her arms and legs, indicating possible physical abuse. The knee scrape I'd mentioned was described as a severe laceration, requiring medical attention I'd negligently failed to provide. Melanie claimed Sophie had developed intense anxiety following the weekend, exhibiting signs of trauma including nightmares, bedwetting, and fear of being left alone with adults. Medical records attached to the filing showed Sophie had been taken to her pediatrician 3 days after the weekend visit with documented bruising and behavioral changes. A child psychologist's report stated Sophie had experienced a traumatic event during the weekend that required ongoing therapy. Photographs showed Sophie with what appeared to be significant bruising on her upper arms, thighs, and back. I stared at these photos in complete confusion, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Sophie had been fine when she left my house. I would have noticed bruising like that. And more importantly, I hadn't done anything that would cause such injuries. I called Nathan immediately after reading the lawsuit, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice flat and cold in a way I'd never heard before. I asked what was happening, why Melanie was suing me when Sophie had been perfectly fine during our weekend together. Nathan said he didn't want to discuss it and that all communication should go through their attorney. I tried to explain that this was insane, that I loved Sophie and would never hurt her, that something was terribly wrong with this entire situation. Nathan said the evidence spoke for itself and hung up. I stood in my kitchen feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach, unable to process how my brother could believe I'd harmed his daughter. We'd been close our entire lives. He'd been at my nursing school graduation, helped me move into my first apartment, supported me through my divorce 3 years ago. Now he was siding with his wife in a lawsuit accusing me of child abuse. The betrayal was staggering, and the implications were professionally devastating. If these allegations became public at my hospital, my nursing career could be destroyed. Accusations of child endangerment, even false ones, were career-ending in pediatric medicine. I contacted an attorney Monday morning, finding Rachel Nguyen through a colleague's recommendation. Rachel specialized in family law and defamation cases, with 20 years of experience defending professionals against false accusations. Her office was downtown in a building overlooking the river, and I met with her that same afternoon. I brought the lawsuit documents and explained the entire situation, describing the weekend with Sophie in detail. Rachel listened carefully, taking notes and asking specific questions about the timing of events, what I'd observed about Sophie's physical condition, and my interactions with Nathan and Melanie afterward. When I finished, Rachel reviewed the attached medical documentation and photographs. She frowned, studying the images closely. "These bruises are extensive," she said. "If Sophie had this level of bruising when she left your care, you would have noticed." I explained that Sophie had been completely fine when her parents picked her up, showing no signs of bruising or distress. Rachel asked if I had any documentation from the weekend, any photos or videos I'd taken. I pulled out my phone and showed her pictures I'd snapped Saturday at the farmer's market and during our cookie baking session Sunday morning. In every photo, Sophie appeared happy and healthy, with no visible bruising on her exposed arms and legs. Rachel's expression sharpened. "This is important. These photos show Sophie without bruising less than 24 hours before her parents picked her up. That timeline doesn't match the medical records Melanie submitted." Rachel explained that we needed to build a comprehensive defense showing the allegations were false and potentially exploring why Melanie would fabricate such serious accusations. She asked about my relationship with Nathan and Melanie, whether there had been any conflicts or tensions before the lawsuit. I mentioned that Melanie had always seemed somewhat controlling, particular about how Nathan spent his time and money, but I'd attributed that to her personality rather than anything sinister. Rachel asked if Nathan and Melanie had financial problems or marital issues I knew about. I said Nathan had mentioned a few months ago that Melanie's sales commissions had decreased due to changes in her company's compensation structure, and they'd had to scale back some expenses. Rachel made notes. Financial stress can motivate false claims, especially if there's insurance or settlement potential. She asked if I had homeowners insurance or professional liability coverage. I confirmed I had both, with significant policy limits given my nursing profession. Rachel nodded grimly. "That's likely what Melanie is targeting. She's not just trying to hurt you. She's trying to access your insurance money through a fabricated claim." The realization made me feel sick. My sister-in-law was willing to destroy my reputation and career to extract money from my insurance policies, and she was manipulating my brother and weaponizing my niece to do it. Rachel requested a $10,000 retainer to begin building our defense, warning that costs could escalate significantly if the case went to trial. I authorized the payment, watching my savings account take a substantial hit. She also recommended I hire a private investigator to examine Sophie's medical records and interview relevant witnesses. The investigator, a former police detective named Carl Winters, came to Rachel's office Wednesday to discuss the case. Carl had 30 years of experience in law enforcement, specializing in fraud investigations and child welfare cases. He reviewed the lawsuit documents with a skeptical expression. "These bruise patterns are interesting," he said. "They're uniform in color and distribution, which is unusual for accidental injuries. Kids who fall or bump into things get scattered bruises in different stages of healing. These look deliberately inflicted." I felt my stomach drop. "Are you saying Melanie hurt Sophie to frame me?" Carl said it was one possibility we needed to investigate, along with examining whether the medical documentation was legitimate or potentially falsified. He'd request complete copies of Sophie's medical records and interview her pediatrician and the child psychologist who'd provided reports. He also wanted to examine my house for any hazards or conditions that could have caused the injuries Melanie described. I gave him permission to access whatever he needed, desperate to prove my innocence. Over the following 2 weeks, Carl conducted a thorough investigation while Rachel prepared our legal response to the lawsuit. Carl interviewed my neighbors, who confirmed seeing me and Sophie playing happily in my backyard that weekend with no signs of distress. He obtained my credit card receipts from the farmer's market and pizza delivery, documenting our activities and timeline. He examined my backyard swing set and house interior, finding no hazardous conditions or sharp edges that could explain the bruising patterns shown in Melanie's photos. Most significantly, Carl obtained Sophie's complete medical records from her pediatrician, Dr. Evelyn Hart. The records revealed something disturbing. Sophie had no history of bruising or injuries prior to the visit documented 3 days after staying with me. However, Dr. Hart's notes included a concerning detail. When Melanie brought Sophie in claiming the injuries occurred at my house, Sophie had seemed confused and hesitant when asked about what happened. The doctor noted, "Child appears coached in responses, story inconsistent with injury presentation." Dr. Hart had been concerned enough to file a report with Child Protective Services, not about me, but about the possibility that Melanie might be fabricating allegations or causing injuries herself. CPS had opened an investigation, but Melanie had apparently convinced them the injuries occurred while Sophie was in my care, directing attention away from herself. Rachel filed our response to the lawsuit, denying all allegations and including our evidence showing Sophie had been healthy during our weekend together. We also filed a counterclaim against Melanie for defamation, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, demanding she provide evidence to support her accusations. The counterclaim requested sanctions for filing a frivolous lawsuit and sought damages for harm to my professional reputation. Melanie's attorney, an aggressive litigator named Douglas Crane, responded with a motion to dismiss our counterclaim, arguing that Melanie was simply protecting her daughter and had legitimate concerns about Sophie's welfare. The judge denied the motion, ruling that both the original lawsuit and counterclaim would proceed to discovery. Discovery meant both sides could subpoena documents, take depositions, and examine evidence. Rachel immediately subpoenaed Sophie's complete medical records from all providers, school records showing any behavioral issues, and Melanie's financial records to establish potential motive. Douglas fought back aggressively, objecting to nearly every discovery request and filing motions to limit what we could access. The judge mostly sided with us, recognizing that if Melanie was making serious allegations about child endangerment, we had the right to examine all relevant evidence. The medical records that arrived during discovery were revealing. Sophie had been taken to 3 different doctors in the week following her stay with me, each time with Melanie claiming the injuries resulted from my negligent care. However, the bruising documented at each visit appeared different in size, color, and location, suggesting new injuries were occurring after Sophie returned home. One emergency room physician had noted concerns about the story not matching the injury pattern and had contacted CPS again. A pattern was emerging of Melanie repeatedly seeking medical attention for Sophie while blaming me, but medical professionals were questioning whether the injuries were actually occurring in Melanie's care. Carl interviewed Dr. Hart, who spoke carefully due to patient confidentiality, but confirmed she'd been concerned about Melanie's behavior from the beginning. The mother seemed overly focused on documenting injuries and building a narrative rather than concerned about her daughter's actual well-being, Dr. Hart told Carl. When I suggested the bruising might be from rough play at home or another source, she became defensive and insisted it happened at the aunt's house. But Sophie's reactions didn't support that story. The child seemed frightened of her mother, not traumatized by staying with her aunt. Rachel scheduled depositions for June, starting with Melanie. I attended the deposition at Douglas Crane's law office downtown, sitting beside Rachel while a court reporter documented everything. Melanie arrived wearing an expensive suit, her appearance carefully curated to project maternal concern and professional credibility. She took the oath and Rachel began questioning her about the weekend Sophie stayed with me. Melanie described dropping Sophie off and feeling hesitant about leaving her, claiming she'd had an intuition something would go wrong. Rachel asked what specific concerns she'd had at the time, and Melanie fumbled, saying just a mother's instinct. Rachel pressed harder, asking why she'd left Sophie with me if she'd had serious concerns. Melanie said she'd trusted her husband's judgment since I was his sister. Rachel produced the text Nathan had sent me weeks before the visit, explicitly asking if I could babysit and expressing confidence in my care. Melanie's face tightened, but she insisted she'd been uncomfortable from the beginning. Rachel then asked about picking Sophie up Sunday afternoon, what condition Sophie had been in, what I'd told them about the weekend. Melanie described me as evasive and suspicious, claiming I'd rushed them out of the house. I felt anger rising but kept my expression neutral. That was a complete lie. They'd been distracted and rushed because Melanie was checking her phone constantly, and they'd left quickly of their own accord. Rachel displayed the photos I'd taken during the weekend, showing Sophie happy and healthy with no visible bruising. Melanie dismissed them, saying bruises take time to appear and the injuries must have occurred Sunday after the photos were taken. Rachel asked her to explain how extensive bruising covering Sophie's arms, legs, and back could develop in the few hours between my last photo at 11 a.m. Sunday and their pickup at 3 p.m., especially when Sophie had been calmly playing with dolls and eating lunch during that time. Melanie said children bruise easily, and I must have hurt Sophie without realizing it. Rachel asked for specific examples of what I might have done to cause such injuries. Melanie speculated that maybe I'd grabbed Sophie too hard, or let her fall, or been rough during playtime. Rachel pointed out that none of these scenarios matched the injury patterns documented in the medical photos, which showed uniform bruising suggesting deliberate force rather than accidental bumps. Melanie became defensive, saying she wasn't a medical expert and was just trying to protect her daughter. Rachel then asked about the timeline of medical visits, why Melanie had taken Sophie to 3 different doctors in 1 week. Melanie claimed she'd been seeking second opinions because the first doctors hadn't taken her concerns seriously. Rachel asked if it was normal for her to doctor shop when she disagreed with medical advice, and Douglas objected, but the damage was done. The pattern of behavior looked suspicious. The most damaging part of Melanie's deposition came when Rachel asked about her finances. Douglas objected repeatedly, but the judge had ruled financial motive was relevant to our defamation counterclaim. Rachel asked about Melanie's employment income, and Melanie admitted her sales commissions had decreased significantly over the past year due to industry changes and increased competition. Her annual income had dropped from $180,000 to approximately $95,000, creating financial pressure. Rachel asked if she and Nathan had discussed their financial difficulties, and Melanie reluctantly confirmed they'd been arguing about money frequently. Rachel then asked when Melanie first learned I had substantial homeowners insurance and professional liability coverage. Melanie insisted she'd never thought about my insurance, but her body language suggested otherwise. Rachel produced phone records showing Melanie had called my insurance company 2 weeks before filing the lawsuit, inquiring about policy limits and claims procedures. Melanie's face went pale. She stammered that she'd been trying to determine if insurance would cover Sophie's medical bills, but Rachel pointed out that my insurance wouldn't cover bills for injuries allegedly caused by me, only damages paid through a lawsuit settlement. Melanie had been researching how much money she could potentially extract before even filing the complaint, suggesting premeditation rather than genuine concern for Sophie's welfare. Nathan's deposition was scheduled the following week, and I dreaded seeing my brother after months of silence. He arrived at the law office looking exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, weight loss visible in his face and frame. When he saw me sitting with Rachel, his expression flickered with something that might have been guilt or pain, but he quickly looked away. Rachel began questioning him about the weekend Sophie stayed with me, and Nathan described dropping her off Friday evening and picking her up Sunday afternoon. He confirmed that I'd mentioned the minor knee scrape, that Sophie had seemed happy and excited about her weekend, and that neither he nor Melanie had observed any concerning injuries when they picked her up. Rachel asked when he first learned about the bruising Melanie claimed Sophie had sustained. Nathan said Melanie told him Wednesday evening, 3 days after the weekend visit, that she'd noticed bruises while helping Sophie change clothes. He'd been alarmed and agreed they should take Sophie to the pediatrician. Rachel asked if he'd personally seen the bruises before that doctor's visit, and Nathan admitted he'd been traveling for work and hadn't actually examined Sophie himself until Thursday evening. "So your knowledge of Sophie's injuries comes entirely from what your wife told you," Rachel confirmed. Nathan nodded reluctantly. Rachel asked Nathan about his relationship with me, how long we'd been close, whether he'd ever had concerns about my care of Sophie before this incident. Nathan's voice became strained as he admitted we'd been close our entire lives, that I'd babysat Sophie regularly without any problems, that he'd trusted me completely. Rachel asked what changed his perception, what evidence convinced him I'd hurt his daughter. Nathan said the medical records and photos were compelling, that multiple doctors had documented injuries. Rachel showed him the photos I'd taken during the weekend, the timeline showing Sophie healthy hours before pickup, the concerning patterns in the medical records suggesting injuries occurred after Sophie returned home. Nathan studied the evidence silently, his expression troubled. Rachel asked directly if he'd ever considered the possibility that someone other than me might be responsible for Sophie's injuries. Douglas objected aggressively, but Nathan answered anyway. His voice barely audible, he said he'd had concerns but Melanie had been so certain, so focused on building the case against me. Rachel asked if Nathan had noticed changes in Melanie's behavior over the past year, particularly related to their financial stress. Nathan admitted Melanie had become increasingly anxious about money, sometimes making comments about people who had insurance payouts or settlements solving their problems. He'd dismissed these as stress-related venting, but sitting in the deposition reviewing the evidence, his face showed growing doubt about his wife's version of events. The most significant break in the case came when CPS investigator Tamara Washington contacted Rachel's office requesting to meet. Tamara was a 15-year veteran of Child Protective Services who'd been assigned to investigate the reports filed by Sophie's doctors. She arrived at Rachel's office on a Friday morning, bringing her case file and a deeply troubled expression. She explained that CPS had been monitoring the situation since the initial doctor's reports, conducting home visits and interviewing family members. Tamara said she'd interviewed Sophie multiple times, and the child's statements had been inconsistent and concerning. "Sophie didn't describe any incidents at your house that would explain her injuries," Tamara told me. "When I asked her what happened at Aunt Katie's, she talked about baking cookies and going to the market. When I asked how she got the bruises, she became quiet and looked at her mother." Children who've experienced trauma usually have vivid recall of the incident, even if they're reluctant to discuss it. Sophie showed no trauma response related to you, but she showed fear responses when her mother was present during our interviews. Tamara had recommended supervised visitation and a forensic child interview at the county's Child Advocacy Center, but Melanie had resisted, claiming it would traumatize Sophie further. That resistance raised red flags for Tamara, who suspected Melanie might be fabricating the allegations or causing the injuries herself. Tamara had been building her own case, documenting concerns but lacking definitive proof until recently. Sophie's kindergarten teacher had contacted CPS after observing concerning behavior. The teacher, Mrs. Louise Blackwell, reported that Sophie had become withdrawn and anxious at school, frequently having accidents and crying during class. More significantly, Mrs. Blackwell had noticed fresh bruises on Sophie's arms on several occasions after weekends at home, bruises that hadn't been visible Friday when Sophie left school. Mrs. Blackwell had documented these observations with dates and photos taken with parent permission during a conference where she'd expressed concerns to Melanie. Melanie had dismissed the bruises as normal childhood injuries, but the teacher was concerned enough to report her observations to CPS. Tamara had interviewed Mrs. Blackwell extensively, and the teacher's documentation showed a pattern of injuries occurring specifically when Sophie was in Melanie's care, not during school hours or the weekend she'd spent with me. Tamara had also discovered that Melanie had been researching personal injury lawsuits and insurance claims extensively in the weeks before filing against me. Her browser history, obtained through a warrant CPS had secured, showed searches for terms like homeowner insurance payout limits, suing family member for negligence, and disturbingly, how to document child injuries for legal case. The pattern suggested deliberate planning rather than a mother genuinely concerned about her child's welfare. Tamara told Rachel she was prepared to testify that in her professional opinion, the evidence suggested Melanie had fabricated or potentially inflicted Sophie's injuries to support a fraudulent lawsuit against me. CPS was preparing to file a dependency petition to remove Sophie from Melanie's care, pending further investigation into abuse allegations against the mother. However, Tamara warned that these cases were complex and difficult to prove definitively without direct evidence or admission. We needed something more concrete, preferably video evidence or witness testimony showing Melanie causing harm. The problem was that most abuse occurred in private, making it nearly impossible to document directly. Rachel asked if there was any way to create conditions where Melanie might reveal her actions or intentions. Tamara said carefully that she couldn't advise entrapment, but if Nathan were willing to install security cameras in the home under the guise of general security concerns, any footage obtained would be admissible. The question was whether Nathan would cooperate, given his apparent loyalty to Melanie despite growing evidence of her deception. Rachel suggested we needed to approach Nathan privately, without Melanie present, and present the accumulated evidence showing his wife had been manufacturing a case against me while potentially abusing their daughter. Arranging to meet Nathan alone proved difficult. Melanie seemed to monitor his communications and schedule carefully, accompanying him to most activities and maintaining control over his availability. Carl Winters finally managed to intercept Nathan at his workplace, calling him from the hospital parking lot and explaining urgently that he needed to see the evidence we'd gathered before the case proceeded further. Nathan agreed reluctantly to meet at a coffee shop near his office during his lunch break, probably because the request came through an investigator rather than directly from me, which might have triggered Melanie's suspicions. Rachel, Carl, and I waited at a corner table in the crowded cafe Wednesday afternoon, watching Nathan arrive looking wary and exhausted. He sat down without ordering anything, his posture defensive. Rachel began by thanking him for meeting and acknowledging this situation was painful for everyone involved. She said she wanted to show him evidence he might not have seen because Melanie controlled the narrative. Nathan started to object, but Rachel opened her laptop and displayed the timeline she'd constructed. Photos of Sophie healthy and happy at my house, time-stamped just hours before pickup. Medical records showing bruising first appearing 3 days later, with patterns inconsistent with accidental injury. Documentation from multiple doctors expressing concerns about the story not matching injuries. CPS reports noting Sophie's fear responses around Melanie. The kindergarten teacher's observations of injuries appearing after weekends at home, not before. Nathan's face changed as he reviewed the evidence, the defensive posture gradually crumbling into something that looked like dawning horror. Rachel showed him Melanie's browser history, the insurance research, the pattern of financial stress motivating a fraudulent claim. She showed him phone records indicating Melanie had contacted my insurance company weeks before filing suit. Nathan's hands were shaking as he held the laptop, scrolling through documentation that told a story completely opposite to what his wife had been saying. Rachel asked gently if he'd ever witnessed Melanie being rough with Sophie, losing her temper, or showing concerning behavior toward their daughter. Nathan was quiet for a long moment before admitting that Melanie had been increasingly short-tempered over the past year, sometimes yelling at Sophie for minor infractions or grabbing her arm roughly when frustrated. He'd attributed this to work stress and had never imagined it might escalate to deliberately causing injury. But looking at the evidence now, the pattern was undeniable. Melanie had manufactured a case against me to access my insurance money, and she'd been willing to hurt their daughter to make her story convincing. Nathan's eyes filled with tears as the realization hit him fully. He asked what he should do, and Rachel said the first priority was protecting Sophie from further harm. Rachel explained that CPS was preparing to remove Sophie from the home, which would be traumatic and public. An alternative was Nathan taking custody voluntarily, separating from Melanie and cooperating with the investigation. Tamara Washington had indicated CPS would support this arrangement if Nathan agreed to supervised visitation with Melanie and installation of security cameras documenting interactions. Nathan asked if this meant divorcing his wife, and Rachel said probably yes. But more importantly, it meant protecting his daughter from someone who'd proven willing to hurt her for financial gain. Nathan sat silently processing everything, the weight of betrayal and responsibility crushing him visibly. Finally, he asked what I wanted. I spoke for the first time, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. I wanted Sophie safe, Nathan's relationship with me repaired, and Melanie held accountable for what she'd done. Nathan nodded slowly, then said he needed to see proof himself, needed to witness Melanie's behavior directly before destroying his marriage based on circumstantial evidence. Carl suggested Nathan install security cameras that evening under the pretense of general home security, a reasonable explanation that Melanie likely wouldn't question. Nathan agreed to try, though his expression showed he desperately hoped we were wrong about his wife's actions. Nathan purchased a wireless security system that afternoon, installing cameras in the living room, kitchen, and Sophie's bedroom that evening. He told Melanie he'd been concerned about a series of break-ins reported in their neighborhood, a plausible story she accepted without much question. The cameras had audio recording and motion detection, streaming to an app on Nathan's phone. For the first 2 days, the footage showed normal family interactions, nothing concerning or problematic. Then Saturday morning, 3 days after installation, the bedroom camera captured something that changed everything. Melanie entered Sophie's room at 6:30 a.m., while Nathan was out running errands. Sophie was playing quietly with dolls, and Melanie sat on the bed watching her daughter with an expression that made my stomach turn when Nathan showed us the footage later. Cold, calculating. Melanie reached out suddenly and grabbed Sophie's upper arm, twisting it hard enough that Sophie cried out. She then grabbed the other arm, leaving what would certainly become visible bruises. Sophie was crying, asking what she'd done wrong, and Melanie's voice on the audio was chilling. "Stop crying or I'll give you something to really cry about. We need to go to the doctor again, and you're going to tell them Aunt Katie was rough with you during visits, understand?" Sophie, confused and frightened, said she didn't visit Aunt Katie anymore, and Melanie said, "I know that, but the doctors don't know that. You're going to tell them you still see your aunt and she hurt you this time too." The footage continued for another 3 minutes, showing Melanie deliberately creating injuries on Sophie's arms and legs while coaching her daughter on what to tell doctors. Sophie was sobbing, clearly not understanding why her mother was hurting her, and Melanie's affect remained flat and businesslike throughout. She was manufacturing evidence for her lawsuit, creating new injuries to support her ongoing claims of my negligence. When she finished, Melanie told Sophie to stop crying and get dressed, that they were going to urgent care. The camera captured her examining her daughter's arms with satisfaction, apparently pleased with the visible bruising she'd created. Nathan had been outside during this incident, returning home to find Sophie upset and Melanie claiming the child had fallen. He'd reviewed the footage later that evening, discovering what his wife had done. He called Rachel immediately, his voice shaking, saying we'd been right about everything. Melanie had been abusing Sophie to support a fraudulent lawsuit, and the evidence was now documented on video. Rachel told Nathan to secure the footage immediately, making multiple copies, and to contact Tamara Washington at CPS. She also told him to get Sophie out of the house that night if possible, bringing her somewhere safe while authorities intervened. Nathan took Sophie to his parents' house Saturday evening, telling Melanie his mother was sick and needed help. Once Sophie was safe with her grandparents, Nathan called 911 and reported child abuse, providing the security footage to responding officers. Police arrived at Nathan's house at 9:15 p.m., finding Melanie at home alone. When confronted with the video evidence, she initially denied everything, claiming the footage was edited or fabricated. But the metadata was intact, the timestamps verified, and her actions were undeniable. Police arrested Melanie on charges of child abuse, fraud, and filing a false police report. She was booked into county jail with bail set at $100,000. Nathan filed an emergency custody petition that night, obtaining temporary sole custody of Sophie with Melanie's visitation suspended pending criminal proceedings. CPS took formal custody temporarily, placing Sophie with Nathan's parents while Nathan completed parenting assessments and established his home as safe. The investigation expanded rapidly, with prosecutors recognizing this wasn't just a domestic incident, but a calculated fraud scheme targeting family members through fabricated abuse allegations. The following Monday, Melanie's attorney Douglas Crane filed an emergency motion to dismiss her lawsuit against me, recognizing the case had collapsed with his client's arrest. Rachel opposed the dismissal, arguing our counterclaim for defamation and malicious prosecution should proceed to hold Melanie accountable for damages. The judge agreed, dismissing Melanie's original claims with prejudice while allowing our counterclaim to continue. Douglas withdrew from representation, unwilling to defend Melanie against criminal charges and civil liability simultaneously. Melanie hired a criminal defense attorney, an expensive lawyer named Victor Lang who specialized in defending white-collar criminals. Victor immediately began negotiating with prosecutors, trying to minimize charges and avoid trial. But the video evidence was devastating, showing premeditated abuse of a child for financial gain. Prosecutors weren't interested in plea deals that didn't include substantial prison time. The media discovered the story, and local news outlets began reporting on the woman who'd abused her daughter to frame her sister-in-law for negligence. The story went viral regionally, with people expressing outrage at Melanie's calculated cruelty. My nursing supervisor at the hospital called to express support, assuring me my job was secure and that hospital administration understood I'd been falsely accused. Colleagues reached out with messages of solidarity, and several offered to testify about my character if needed. The criminal trial proceeded quickly, with prosecutors eager to make an example of Melanie's egregious behavior. The trial lasted 1 week, during which the jury watched security footage of Melanie deliberately injuring Sophie while coaching her to lie about my care. They heard testimony from Dr. Hart, Mrs. Blackwell, Tamara Washington, and multiple medical experts explaining how the injury patterns supported deliberate abuse rather than accidental harm. Nathan testified about Melanie's financial stress, her research into insurance claims, and her changing behavior towards Sophie over the past year. I testified about the weekend Sophie stayed with me, describing normal activities and Sophie's healthy condition when she left my care. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: child abuse, fraud, filing false reports, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, allowing time for pre-sentencing reports and victim impact statements. Sophie's therapist, who'd been working with her since Nathan gained custody, submitted a detailed report about the psychological damage Melanie's abuse had caused. Sophie suffered from anxiety, trust issues, and confusion about why her mother had hurt her. The therapist's prognosis was guardedly optimistic, believing Sophie could recover with consistent therapy and stable home environment, but the trauma would have lasting effects. At sentencing, the judge delivered a scathing assessment of Melanie's conduct. She'd abused her position as a mother, exploited her daughter's vulnerability, and weaponized the legal system to commit fraud against a family member who'd shown nothing but love toward her niece. The judge said Melanie's calculated planning and lack of remorse warranted substantial punishment. She imposed 15 years in state prison on the combined charges, with eligibility for parole after serving 85% of the sentence. Melanie's face remained expressionless as the sentence was announced, showing the same cold affect captured on the security footage. She was immediately remanded to custody, beginning her prison term at the Women's Correctional Facility 60 miles north of the city. Nathan filed for divorce the same week, and Melanie's parental rights were terminated following a separate family court proceeding. She would have no contact with Sophie or legal standing as a parent. The termination was necessary to provide Sophie stability and protect her from further harm, though Nathan expressed sadness about erasing Sophie's mother from her life. But Melanie had destroyed that relationship herself through her abusive actions. Our civil counterclaim against Melanie proceeded simultaneously, seeking damages for the harm her false accusations caused me professionally and personally. My attorney fees had exceeded $45,000. I'd lost freelance nursing shifts due to time spent defending myself, and my reputation had been damaged by the initial allegations. Rachel argued that Melanie should be held financially accountable for these damages, even though she currently lacked resources to pay. The court agreed, awarding me $280,000 in compensatory and punitive damages. Melanie owned a rental property acquired before her marriage, which was sold to partially satisfy the judgment. I received approximately $95,000 after the sale, with the remaining judgment amount attachable to any future assets or income Melanie might obtain after release from prison. The money helped cover my legal expenses and compensate for lost income, though the financial recovery couldn't repair the emotional damage or lost time. More importantly, the judgment stood as a legal recognition that Melanie's actions had been wrong and harmful, validating my experience and officially clearing my name. Rebuilding my relationship with Nathan and Sophie took time and patience. Nathan was devastated by Melanie's betrayal, struggling with guilt about not recognizing her behavior sooner and protecting Sophie more effectively. He attended therapy individually and participated in family counseling with Sophie, working to understand the trauma they'd experienced and develop healthier dynamics. Sophie initially was confused about why her mother was gone and whether she'd done something wrong. Her therapist helped her understand that adults, not children, are responsible for adult choices, and that her mother's actions weren't Sophie's fault. Gradually, Sophie became more relaxed and playful, showing the personality I remembered from before the lawsuit. Nathan asked if I'd be willing to spend time with Sophie again, supervised at first given the trauma, to rebuild our relationship. I agreed cautiously, meeting them at parks and restaurants where Sophie could feel safe. Initially, she was shy and uncertain, but within a few visits, she was hugging me and asking to bake cookies like we'd done during that fateful weekend. The resilience of children never ceased to amaze me. Nathan and I worked to repair our fractured sibling relationship, acknowledging the pain his choice to believe Melanie had caused while understanding the manipulation he'd experienced. He apologized repeatedly for doubting me, for choosing his wife's version of events over our lifelong bond, for putting me through months of legal hell defending against false accusations. I appreciated his apologies, but actions mattered more than words. Nathan proved his commitment to rebuilding trust through consistent behavior, including me in Sophie's life, being transparent about his struggles and fears, and actively working to become a better father and brother. We attended family therapy sessions together, processing the betrayal and trauma while establishing new patterns of communication and trust. It wasn't easy or quick, but gradually we found our way back to a relationship that felt authentic, though different from what existed before Melanie's destructive actions. Some wounds leave permanent scars, changing the landscape even after healing. Sophie is now 7 years old, thriving in second grade and showing no outward signs of the trauma she experienced. She sees her therapist monthly for maintenance sessions, addressing issues as they arise but generally functioning well. She lives with Nathan in a smaller house he purchased after selling the home he'd shared with Melanie, creating new memories in a space untainted by her mother's abuse. I see Sophie regularly, usually once a week for dinners or outings. We've baked cookies many times since the lawsuit, reclaiming that activity as something positive rather than something poisoned by Melanie's false accusations. Sophie calls me Aunt Katie and tells me about school, friends, and whatever captures her 7-year-old attention. She doesn't talk about her mother, and I don't bring her up. If Sophie asks questions, Nathan answers honestly but age-appropriately, explaining that her mother made bad choices that hurt people and is in prison as a consequence. Whether Sophie will want to explore that relationship when she's older remains uncertain, but for now, she's focused on being a kid surrounded by adults who actually protect rather than exploit her. 2 years after Melanie's conviction, I received a letter forwarded through Rachel's office. Melanie had written from prison, a 3-page handwritten note attempting some form of apology or explanation. I read it once, then filed it away without responding. The letter claimed Melanie had been suffering from mental illness and financial desperation, that she'd convinced herself the ends justified the means, and that she regretted hurting Sophie and destroying her family. There was no real acknowledgement of the harm she'd caused me specifically, no genuine remorse for fabricating abuse allegations and putting me through legal hell. The letter felt more like an attempt to rehabilitate her own self-image than authentic accountability. I had no interest in corresponding with the woman who'd tried to destroy my life and hurt my niece to access my insurance money. Rachel advised me that I was under no obligation to respond, and I chose silence. Some people don't deserve your energy or forgiveness, particularly when their apologies serve their needs rather than addressing your harm. My career recovered fully from the accusations Melanie leveled against me. Once the truth emerged publicly and she was convicted of fraud and abuse, my professional reputation was restored. The hospital issued a statement supporting me and acknowledging I'd been falsely accused, which helped counteract any lingering doubt. I received letters from colleagues, former patients' families, and community members expressing support and outrage at what Melanie had done. Some shared their own experiences with false accusations or family betrayal, finding solidarity in my story. I returned to work at the pediatric emergency department, finding renewed purpose in protecting children after witnessing how Sophie had been exploited and harmed. Every shift reminded me why the work mattered, why advocating for vulnerable kids was essential, and how easily systems could fail without vigilant professionals asking questions. The experience made me a better nurse, more attuned to inconsistencies in injury explanations, and more willing to report concerns even when family members seemed credible and sympathetic. Looking back on everything that happened, I struggle with complicated emotions about Melanie, Nathan, and the justice system. Melanie received appropriate punishment for her crimes, serving time in prison for abusing Sophie and attempting to defraud me. The legal system ultimately worked, exposing her lies and holding her accountable. But the process was slow, expensive, and traumatic. I spent months defending myself against false accusations, watching my savings drain through legal fees, experiencing the anxiety of potential professional destruction. The system only functioned because I had resources to hire good attorneys and investigators, because medical professionals documented their concerns, and because Nathan eventually chose to believe evidence over his wife. Without those factors, Melanie might have succeeded in her fraud scheme, leaving me destroyed and Sophie continuing to suffer abuse. That reality is sobering, highlighting how many people face false accusations without the resources or support to defend themselves effectively. I was lucky in many ways, even though the experience was devastating. Others in similar situations might not have the same advantages or outcomes. Nathan occasionally asks if I've forgiven Melanie, and I honestly don't know how to answer. Forgiveness implies releasing resentment and wishing the person well, neither of which accurately describes my feelings. I'm not consumed by anger anymore, but I don't wish Melanie well or hope for her redemption. She made calculated choices to hurt her daughter and destroy my life for financial gain. Those choices revealed her character in ways that can't be erased by time or punishment. I've moved forward, rebuilt my life and relationships, and found peace. But that's different from forgiveness. Maybe some actions don't deserve forgiveness, or maybe I'm not capable of that level of grace. Either way, I've stopped caring about what Melanie deserves from me emotionally. She's irrelevant to my life now except as a cautionary tale about trusting the wrong people and the damage that financial desperation can motivate. Sophie deserved better than the mother she got. Nathan deserved better than the wife he married. And I deserved better than having my love for my niece weaponized against me. We all survived, and that has to be enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.